My name is Jill Coyle, and welcome to another episode of No One Dies from Divorce, where we talk the nitty-gritty aspects of divorce and help each other come through this not only surviving, but thriving. I'm a divorce attorney, and I'm interviewing other experts and people just like you who are going through or have been through a divorce, so you can have the latest and greatest information on all things before, during, and after divorce. Let's dive in. All right, welcome to another episode of No One Dies from Divorce. Today we are talking about, I think, what is a very, very common issue in divorce, and that is divorcing with a business. Whether you're an owner, co-owner, partial owner, we're going to talk all things business today. And I have somebody that I like to consider a close personal friend, but actually is an expert in this field that is going to be able to lend a lot of advice. And I am really excited. Kurt, thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here.
So Kurt Anderson, just so you know, is our expert today. He is a professor at BYU Law School. He joined the BYU Law faculty in 2015. But prior to that, he was an executive vice president and general counsel of Match.com, or it's the Match Group, which owns and operates the world's largest online dating platform, which you know as Match.com, Tinder, meetic, okcupid, and over 40 other brands. The Match Group's market capitalization is currently over $45 billion. And prior to joining Match Group, he was a partner in the Dallas office of Baker Botts, an international law firm with 13 offices in 7 countries. He earned his undergraduate and law degree from BYU. Thank you, Curtis, so much for being here.
Happy to be here. It's always a very interesting topic.
And the interesting thing is, Kurt, actually, I consider a pretty close personal friend because he actually knew my husband in Dallas. They lived together in the close proximity. Families knew each other, and my husband has known you forever.
One of my claims to fame is we hosted a reception for Ryan and Jill's wedding at our house.
In Dallas.
That's how I met Jill the first time. I don't think you're even married yet.
We went to dinner or something. Like you were one of the first people he wanted to introduce me for when he took me to Dallas.
Well, he wanted to make the pitch to use our house to do a Texas reception. So
True.
That was fun.
No, I actually think that he wanted Kurt's approval of me. He's always looked just up to you, and he always, I know, respected your opinion.
I think I pulled you aside and said, Jill, are you sure?
Probably. No, it's been great. And over the years, we've been able to maintain that friendship, but also Kurt is currently, helping me with my businesses and my ventures. So, we have a lot to talk about, and he has a lot of, knowledge. I mean, I think the best thing I can, if you know Kurt, just who he is, he's one of the smartest people I've ever known regarding business. And I love the fact that you were general counsel for the Match Group, for Match.com, and you basically led the way for Tinder to become a thing.
I wouldn't say I led the way to Tinder, but I was definitely behind the scenes trying to keep the founders from going too far to the right or to the left. And so I was the general counsel for Tinder for its first several years of existence, and it was a little bit of a wild ride. It was fun.
Oh my gosh, it's so fun. Anyways, it's just a great, I think, claim to fame. And now he's a BYU Law School professor, teaching what I would say one of my worst and hated classes in law school. Commercial paper, which I don't think you teach, but it was literally, it quickly made me realize that I didn't want to go another step further to go to, acquisitions and what you're teaching at the law school. Transactional. It was so hard. But what's funny is when I started studying for the bar is when I really was able to sit down with the outlines. And I was like, okay, commercial paper, it's just write the same thing for every single problem. And you'll sure enough get enough points that at the end they're like, okay, she knows something about this.
Well, I took moot court and knew very quickly I was never going to be a courtroom lawyer. So,
which is funny because I did moot court. I was national arbitration champion. I loved moot court. So, different folks for different strokes. And what's great is that Kurt, like I said, is helping me with all this business stuff as I'm growing, Simple Ending, you guys have heard of, one of my tech firms. And then I'm growing these law offices. He's just been exactly what I've needed because I didn't go to business school. I don't understand the contracts and stuff behind that. But what's been fabulous and about this subject is that because I'm a high conflict divorce firm, we have a lot of people that come to our firm with very, very high assets. And a lot of them own or partially own businesses. And I think through my experiences of running my own, through understanding taxes, it has really put me in a place where I can be better educated to talk to my clients about this is what's going to happen. And then also go to court and educate the judges, because a lot of the judges haven't dissolved the business or they haven't done, business law. And so even for them, it's a little bit overwhelming. And so they really, I think, appreciate an attorney that can come in and say, okay, this is what makes sense. This is how this is going to work. But Kurt, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this because businesses in divorce is, whenever I hear that there is a business within the marriage, I'm always like, okay, we're going to have a couple issues. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is that most people don't want to pay an attorney to set up their business to do their right. So he's nodding over here because he knows that that was me. Like when I started up Coil Law, I just did it on my own. I did it on the website. I was like, this is easy. And it wasn't until I started growing and getting into the depths of like tax plan or estate planning and tax planning and, business planning that finally they were like, we're going to reorganize your entire company to be right on. So what I wanted to kind of talk to you about is that why would you say it's so important to make sure when you're setting up your company to do it right the first time?
Well, it is. There are lots of areas that you can clean it up later. It's almost always going to be more expensive to clean it up later. And it's also not near as difficult, I think, as people think it is to take some steps early on to do it right. And, one aspect of doing it right, I think, is, and even if you don't use a lawyer, even putting it in writing yourself is much better than having nothing in writing.
Right.
And so, when I talk about formation issues for relatively small companies starting, there's really three topics that we'll spend some time with. The founders will say, yeah, we could do something with that. The first is when you capitalize it. And if you have a company owned by a husband and a wife, capitalization is not complicated. And what I mean by capitalization is someone has to put in a little bit of money to get the company going, and you have to issue shares if it's a corporation,
right?
Membership interests if it's an LLC, who owns how many and how much and what percentage. And having that documented early on, most business founders are good about that, right? They want to know who owns what.
Right.
And then second is sometimes more important, and that is how were decisions made? Is it majority? Is it unanimous? And again, with companies controlled or owned by spouses, that also tends not to be a very dramatic decision early on because,
right.
Of course, every couple thinks they'll agree on everything. And then the final thing, which is probably where we'll spend most of our time, are exit strategies.
Yes.
And that is, who and when do people have a right to either exit themselves or require an exit of somebody else without terminating the company, or just is the result just shutting down the entire company, which may be the worst business outcome, but the only viable solution when emotions are high. And so we'll usually talk about those three things. How are you going to fund it? How are decisions made? And how or when, if any, are there situations where one person can either require the company to buy them out or buy out the other person?
Right. And a lot of times when I get a business and I'm looking at this, estate of these parties, they maybe have set it up, but they don't have like a proper operating agreement that would actually have a proper exit strategy. And that's where we're like, okay, this is going to be a little bit complicated. So one of the things that I see a lot of, first of all, when you own a business and you're getting divorced, you need to know your state laws, okay, regarding divorce. So you need to know, is my business, whether my spouse is a part of it on paper or not, actually considered a marital owner by law? And in Utah specifically, we're an equitable divided state, which means whether that piece of paper says that your spouse is a owner, part owner, whether your spouse has been working in the company or not, the asset of the business is going to be considered marital. And therefore, you're going to have to go through the process of deciding, like you said, what is the exit strategy to ensure, is the business going to be able to stay viable? Is it worth something and you're going to have to pay out your spouse? Or what are you going to have to do, because it's going to be considered an asset? And I want to be very clear about that. There are a lot of businesses that are not technically assets, right? They're technically debt, or they're a sales force, and therefore they don't necessarily have assets. They have income stream, which is a whole different thing that you have to kind of look at. And we'll talk a little bit maybe about that, where you have to know if there's an actual asset of the business or if there's an income stream, because those are going to be treated differently in Utah, because an asset is possibly equally divided. But an income stream is going to be then a shift of income argument regarding for alimony and stuff. So there's a lot of questions that are going to have to be answered. And I mean, the first thing I can tell you is you need to know your state laws. And probably the best thing to do that is talk to a really good, competent divorce attorney that understands the splitting of a business or that different thinking. A lot of attorneys. We'll just edit that out. A lot of attorneys will not understand the difference of that. And so they'll want to come and say, well, they're making an income stream of this per year, therefore we're going to do actually, let's talk about this, because I really do want to talk about this, about the difference of an asset and an income stream business. When you're looking just at a business, what is the best way to determine value, or to determine if there is the difference between an asset-based and an income-based?
Yeah, there are really a lot of different methods to determine the value of an asset. And I'm going to slightly rephrase how you've been characterizing. I think any business can have it's either an asset or income stream. Both of those have value. It's just you value them very differently. So, for example, I'll tell you one thing that is never in my opinion, a very useful tool to determine what the value of a company is, are tax returns.
Yes.
The purpose of a tax return is not to value a company or to determine at any point in time what it would be sold for. A tax return is literally determining what is your taxable income. And there are all kinds of incentives and aspects of the tax code that are intended to motivate certain behavior that will result in a very skewed the net profit of a company is often not very closely correlated to what the actual positive cash flow is.
Right.
And of course, with tax returns, the value of the underlying assets are relatively irrelevant. It's almost all in cash flow. And so if you have a business, for example, that owns real estate, so the couple owns a bunch of apartment complexes, that is going to be a heavy, what's called essentially a balance sheet type business. You have a lot of assets required, a lot of capital, i.e. a lot of money to build up those assets, and those assets are going to be carried on the balance sheet. And if you sell your business, you're selling tangible assets.
Right.
And the income stream is predictable, and the income stream is important for real estate, but there's also an element of the underlying assets increasing in value.
Yeah.
Now, a different example would be a software company. And there are some software companies that, developing the software and building the software takes a lot of capital and a lot of cash, but nothing like buying an office complex.
Right.
And therefore, selling the software is dependent less on, and it's really not even a tangible asset. It's just, here's a bunch of code, right?
Yeah.
But the income stream is, it will, and the royalties or the license fees are going to be far more valuable than, in many respects, than rent of a building. And so, when you value a business, some are essentially balance sheet businesses, which are, you buy a lot of assets, you go out, get a valuation of the assets, and do a formula or based on the tangible assets, and others are going to be just pure income stream values. They're both going to be valuable businesses. And so the valuation techniques can be different depending on the type of business you're buying.
Right. And it's interesting because what I do, I mean, I'm thinking of examples in my line of work right now with those two different, with more of an income stream and then an asset based. And what's interesting is you'll get attorneys that come in and just will be like, we get half the value of this business, even though it's an income stream. So basically, they're asking the court to award them future income earnings based on a prediction that this could happen. And I, specifically argue against that, because you are putting the income stream, the future income stream of the company in jeopardy in the fact that if you're having to pay out a certain amount of money without them taking on the risk of the fact that the company might not make money next month, you're literally giving somebody this like hands-free money. And there's a lot of attorneys that will come in and they'll just demand that. And I'm like, I'll take this to court because I think I can convince a judge to understand why that puts them in a very, very vulnerable position and is very, very bad for business. You then also,
but the argument is not that there's not an asset. It's just what's the value of the asset.
Yes.
Because if it is a very predictable, steady stream of income, you can value what the present value of that equals.
Yeah.
And if it's not, I mean, if say it's more of a startup or you're still developing your customer, I mean, your licensee base, then you would still, I mean, there are a lot of companies that the current income stream may be actually far lower than what it's going to be in 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And you actually would want to value it right then.
Right.
If you're in a divorce and say, let's value it right now and let's lock in the value, versus waiting 2 or 3 years when the value may be double or triple, So yeah,
right.
it can sort of cut both ways depending on whose interest you're representing.
See, and my argument is for that on the divorce side is that I would be arguing that if you are wanting an income stream, that's alimony. That's a need-based, and then that is actually something you can change in the future by showing substantial change if the income stream goes down. But again, a lot of people want to argue that it's an asset, that's how much the company is projected to make, and therefore I get half of that. It's a very, I think litigious issue that some attorneys just attempt, and usually it's the attorneys obviously that don't own the business, because then they come in with these creative, colorful arguments of I want as much money as possible. And since we're an equitable state, which, does not mean fair, but it means that the court is going to do what they believe is equitable to allow both parties to live some semblance inside the marriage, outside the marriage. It's important for you to have an attorney that understands the difference of this so that you don't stipulate to put yourself in a position that's going to cause you to, for bankruptcy or something like that.
Well, and I've also seen situations where, in a divorce where one party had a more sophisticated lawyer and actually, as you mentioned, got, as part of the decree, a share of future revenues, and that did not really, I think, accurately reflect the work and the effort and the risk that was retained by the other spouse. They're doing all the work, taking on all the risk, and the non-participating spouse is really reaping essentially an undue amount of the profits.
Right.
And it is sort of sad to see that happen.
We had a client that came just this summer, and he was in the midst of just trying to do this amicably on his own. He was still very, very emotional in that stage, and he felt like he could just, he wanted to just take care of his family. And when he finally came to us, he was like, I think my wife's trying to take advantage of me. And what it was he was offering alimony, and obscenely amount of alimony, because he makes decent money. But then he was going to give her future earnings of like a certain amount. And he's the business. I mean, he's the income stream. So I came to him. I said, this is not how this works. Nobody gets future earnings. Utah is a prospective state. They're going to look at what you're earning right now to determine child support, alimony, and the asset. So you want to keep that in mind, that future earnings should never go into play. Now, granted, if you value the asset or the business at this time and you get a dollar amount, you can definitely create a payment schedule of how you pay that out. But you want to be very careful when you start negotiating terms and you're claiming future earnings, because that's not what Utah's going to look at. One of the things that we see as problems is, what do you do with the fact that you put your spouse on the company because they were told, you need a minority share, or you wanted a woman owner because with that you can get some, but they have done nothing with the business. And they've just kind of reaped the benefit of just their co-owners, but yet they have never had to do anything with the business. How do you treat that kind of situation?
Well, I've seen two types. There are, and this is in my experience, the exception, but I've seen it, is that actually some couples are better business partners than they are spouses.
Yeah.
And I have seen and know of some situations where they co-own a business, and I've seen both sides. Sometimes the wife is the creative genius. She's the one that's done a lot of the work, and for whatever reason, for funding or something else, they felt like they needed to show dual ownership, and I've seen the reverse. And so in some cases, some couples are able to actually successfully run a business even after divorce. And I think people have to at least be aware of that being a possibility when you're structuring what happens.
Yeah.
Right? Probably the more common is either they don't work as well together after the divorce, or they just want a clean break, right? Even if they did, just one of them's like, look, you run the business and I am going to go do something else. And the way I'll usually approach this is, and there's what I would call voluntary situations and involuntary. Involuntary, I think, is easy. Involuntary is where the state steps in, or the divorce court, and says, we're going to divide, or we're going to give a piece of this to one of the spouses as part of the divorce decree. And at that point, and especially if you have other owners, that the other owners are going to be really nervous about that, right?
Yeah.
Last thing you want to do is have 5 or 6 owners and then have 2 of the 6 be going through a marital dissolution. That makes the other 4 nervous. It's just could result in something that is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And so we'll usually have a provision that says in the governance documents, if there is a dissolution of the marriage, then the company has the right to just, it's called the call option. Just that we can buy your interests. We can just take it back. And then, so you'll take an asset and you'll change it from equity to a promissory note or cash.
Right.
So it's still a marital asset, still in the books. It's now just you've liquidated it.
Yeah. And
so the company can step in and take that and just remove that as, it's usually a may, not shall. So the company can do it, but doesn't have to. That's one alternative, and that just sort of avoids one spouse is not buying from the other. There's not a fight of that. It's just the company steps in and buys it back. The other is more the voluntary, and sometimes that is also can be a call option, which is I can call it from you and buy it. And sometimes it can be the other owners have the right to do it. The spouses have the right to buy it from each other. And we used to call this a Texas straw, where if one spouse makes the other spouse an offer to buy their equity, and the other spouse, the recipient, has 2 choices. They can either accept that offer if they think it's a good value and sell, or they can buy the offering spouse's equity at the same price and be the buyer. Yeah. So it sort of keeps people honest on pricing. And in the end, those are sort of you just sort of work out a deal, right? Yeah. You have a backstop, like you have the company having the right to take you both out if you don't solve something. But it's really to encourage the spouses to sort of work something out
Yeah.
that's better for all the owners, if there are other ones, or it's best for the business. And hopefully they can just cut a deal. But it really does help to have lawyers involved in a divorce that understand how it's set up, so they can, there's nothing more difficult than trying to get a deal done if one of the lawyers doesn't know what they're doing.
Right.
And they're just causing problems and trying to sort of amicably just take this one piece of the divorce or marital estate and just clean it up so that it doesn't otherwise unduly harm the company.
Right. Right. And one thing I want to say with that is that when you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with the business through a divorce, valuations. We hear this all the time, that if you own a business, we're going to do what's called a business valuation. And I want to just offer a little caution to you out there, if you're listening to this, is that there are good business valuators who know what they're doing, and there are bad ones. And there are ones that if you go and hire first and they come back with a value that wasn't done properly, because just like Kurt said a little bit ago, there are different ways of valuing a business. And you need to make sure that you have a business valuator that will go through all the different, ways of being able to do it. It's kind of like, I look at like a house appraisal. If you're going to do a proper house appraisal, you're going to have a two-way approach. You're going to first of all have the appraiser go through the house, look at it, and determine a value based on what they think. But then they're going to do comparables, and they're going to go out and then they're going to look around your neighborhood to see what house is sold. And they're going to combine the two to come up with a value that they believe is correct. I think on a business valuation, it needs to be done exactly the same way. There's different approaches, and I actually didn't bring the list of all the approaches, but there's different approaches. And the best thing you can do is have an appraiser a business evaluator that understands those different approaches and can lay them out. Because like I said, no two companies are really going to be exactly the same. And you want to make sure that the value that you're getting on your business is proper and done. I think it's funny because I hear a lot of people are like, well, we just do the Shark Tank approach. And I'm like, what? You're going to take your gross income, you're going to times it by 2.5, and you're going to claim that that's what your business is worth? Okay, go out and try to sell your business for that. And they're always like, I don't think anybody would buy that. So why would you want to value your business at that? Because literally you want your valuation to be at a price point that somebody is really willing and going to pay. Because at the end of the day, if you have to give your spouse half of your value, you want to make sure that you have a choice that you could sell it and actually make up that value. And don't walk into the process thinking, well, I'm so good at what I do, I'm just going to value it as much as possible. I use my business as an example, and Kurt will laugh at this because he knows my husband better and Ryan hates this when I use our marital, issues to kind of make examples of divorce, but it works. And so when you look at my business, my law firm, it is an absolute income stream. It is only worth exactly what our attorneys bill, and we're, we live and die by the bill and what we bring in. And so you can't just go in and say, okay, here's a number, times it by 2.5, because somebody would come in and buy that. Nobody would buy my law firm for that. If that was the case, I would sell today. You think you could do that? So you want to be really, really cautious about that, about how you do that. Kurt, I wanted to talk a little bit about, so one of the things that we also get is, okay, maybe your spouse is not part of the companies in theory, or in actuality, they're not on the LLC or they're not in the operating agreement. However, they've received a K-1 through the company for tax purposes. How do you deal with that when you're looking at that going through divorce?
Well, if they receive a K-1, that means they're an owner in some form or another.
Right. Which I will tell you, and this will make you cringe, I can't tell you how many people come into my office and they have a operating agreement that says they're the sole owner of the company, and their wife's been getting a K-1 for the last 3, 4, 5 years. And you're like, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, the accountants would have to deal with that. From the lawyer's perspective, if money is going from the company to you, it's either because you're an employee, which means you show up with a W-2, you're an independent contractor, which means you show up with a 1099, or you are receiving ownership distributions or distributions of cash flow, which means it is a K1 if it's a partnership.
Right.
If you're taxed like a partnership. It's a dividend if you are a corporation. And so if you show up with a K1, the lawyer is going to assume that means that there's some ownership component to that relationship. Otherwise, you should not be receiving a K1, which means you are literally, the statement is I'm an equity owner somewhere. Even if it's not documented,
Yep.
I'm taking the position with the IRS and I'm signing I will not commit fraud on my tax return. And I'm saying this person is an equity owner. And even the K1 has to show the ownership percentages in there.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of where you really need to make sure your tax accounting is consistent with your corporate documents. Otherwise, you have to clean it up, and it just gives. I mean, anytime the experts have to come in and fight and argue and clean it up, it's just it's going to take money out of the marital estate that should go to the spouses, right? And so yeah, it's the idea of operating cleanly going in, and it'll make it much easier to, I think, amicably resolve something going out.
Right. And we get so many times when they're like, well, they don't have ownership. And then I look right on their tax returns. I'm like, but she's, or he's getting a K1.
They have ownership or they have committed tax fraud.
Yes.
You choose which one you want to, when you go with.
And that's the thing is I have to explain that to him, that you can't have it both ways. And so, and a lot of times they're like, oh, we just haven't redone our operating agreement since 1992, and of course nobody's looking at it until somebody has to look at it, but that's why it makes so much sense, especially if you're running a business, to make sure that they coincide. One of the things we've talked about too is in Utah specifically, if that spouse is getting a K1 or some kind of draw, a paycheck, a W-2, a 1099, there is argument to say then whatever contribution they've made to the company has already been paid out. So you want to think about that as well. There's a new case that came down, I think this year specifically, that says from the appellate court in Utah that says if they are receiving income based off of whatever contribution they're making to the company, saying they're doing the books or they're, ordering coffee or whatever their job is, if they're already getting a paycheck because of that, then the court can look at that as, hey, their value has already been paid out. So that's another way that you might want to look at this, is if your spouse is in the company and doing stuff, it probably makes sense to be paying them.
Yeah. So to make sure I understand, if you are being paid as an employee or a contractor, then that payment is evidence of completely, receiving full value of what you did.
Right.
If it's a K1, that means you are only receiving a share of profits, which means there's an underlying asset that's kicking off those profits that you'd also have to value in the divorce.
Exactly.
Is that okay?
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And even with the K1, you can make the argument, even though they're getting an ownership draw or a profit share, that still have been compensated if they've done any work in the business. The reason why that's important is because at the end of the day, if they come in and they say, well, I'm, part owner, I want all these shares, the court's going to look at who's contributed the most to the business when deciding if they're going to dissolve it, they're going to award it to one or the other. And if somebody's just been in there, doing bookkeeping duties or doing, things where the other person has been the full, 99% of what the business is, they will kind of look at that as, well, we're going to make sure that you've been compensated for what you've done in the business, which could help in a split. So, I've dealt with construction companies, I think, are the biggest. I've dealt with a lot of them because they're the ones who have hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets because, cement trucks and backhoes are so expensive, but then they also have an income stream of getting jobs. And so you kind of have to do a multi-look approach to decide, okay, there is definitely assets within this company, but then there's an income stream. And you want to keep those separate, like I said, because if you're going to have to pay your spouse alimony based off the income you're getting from the business, you want to make sure you don't allow a double dip of getting a profit share from the company because they want they say that some of that income is technically theirs, but then yet they're also awarded alimony. And that's what I want to, what I try to teach, because I see it so many times in court where attorneys are arguing completely opposite of that. And it's double dipping, and it's not fair. We already talked about tax returns are the worst thing to look at when trying to value a business or determining.
Well, they may be the best if you're trying to get a low valuation.
True.
Because everyone is motivated to pay. I mean, as the Supreme Court said a long time ago, everyone is obligated to pay their taxes, but no one is obligated to pay more than $1 more than they're required to.
Right.
And so, tax returns are inherently created to lower the net income as much as possible.
Yes.
And in many cases, the IRS code is in trying to encourage certain behaviors and giving certain write-offs to some businesses. And so, in other words, there's nothing about the code that's going to inflate the value of a business, and there's nothing about people's behavior in preparing tax returns that's going to inflate or even accurately reflect what the value of the business is.
Right.
And so tax returns it may be a factor you look at, but it's frankly not really relevant to evaluation ever. And it's, financial statements are different. Right. Financial statements, financial accounting and tax accounting are not the same thing. And so if somebody walks in and asks me, look, I need a value on this business we're looking at here, the tax returns, my response is, well, I need the financial statements.
Right.
And those are different because aren't necessarily at different lines on the financial statements. You're not fully embedding in some of the tax consequences that may lower value.
Right. And that's one of the things, like you look at your profit and loss for your company, and you're going to get your gross, and then you're going to get your deductions, and you're going to get your net. And
then you get your taxable below that.
Yes. Yeah. And then that's what I was going to say. Then you go over to your taxes, and then they're going to take,
depreciation, amortization. But also, and that gives you a number. But to go back to what you said before, if somebody came to me and said, okay, here is COIL law, I want to buy COIL law. And so you look at the gross, which I'm not going to pay much attention to.
Right.
You look at the net, which I'll pay more attention to. And then I will ask, okay, does Jill Coyle stay with the business? Because if Jill Coyle is not working with the business post-close, that could be a significant decrease in the value.
Yeah.
Is Jill Coyle walking away but agrees not to compete?
Yep. Then
that will have another adjustment. Or if Jill Coyle's like, I'm walking away and I'm going to set up shop across the street and I'm going to start competing against you. Well, those result in three very different values.
Right.
That have nothing to do with the balance sheet and have nothing to do with historical financial. And so when you do a valuation, your financial statements show you what has happened. But often what's more important is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's an art, not a science.
Yeah.
There's no formula that says what is Jill Coyle worth if she agrees for 5 years to work full time for the business I'm buying for me, versus Jill Coyle is going to set up shop next to me and do the exact same thing and compete against me.
Yeah.
But the valuations are going to be starkly different with nothing to do with the balance sheet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, like I said, it's very, very important to ensure that when you're getting a valuator to talk about this, that you get somebody like her that's looking at all the picture. Because one of the things we get is that, we get financial declarations, and they have to fill those out with their reasonable and necessary need and their marital standard of living. And then at the very top of the document, they look at, what is your gross income and what's your net income. And that's very, very important for purposes of child support, gross income, and alimony net income. And we get so many people that take their tax returns, they take their gross income from their tax return. That's what they use as their income. And then you realize when they go down and they do their reasonable and necessary need that they're not even making enough money they're claiming to cover what their monthly expenses, but yet they have no debt, they have lots of savings, and the court just isn't going to believe that. In fact, what the court will do is they'll look at your tax returns and they'll add in all of the exemptions that you're doing, or deductions that you're doing, cell phones and cars, and because we flow so many expenses through our business that you want to claim that, the court's going to add those back in because they're going to want you to pay child support based off of that gross income. So those are just things that you have to be thinking about. And you have to realize that if you're making your numbers look that unrealistic, the court's going to look at you and they're going to come up with their own number, and it might not be something that you like. So make sure that you do your financials correctly.
Or just recognize what the purposes are. I mean, there's the tax return. Again, there's no reason you should inflate anything on your tax returns, right? You should take advantage of every deduction and credit that is available to you, but knowing that that doesn't, for example, does not reflect your positive cash flow.
Right.
Like in the business world, we take financial statements. We use something like, sometimes it's called EBITDA, which is you take your earnings, which is essentially your gross minus your cost of services.
Right.
So it's like your positive cash flow. Well, you start from your taxable income, but then you add back in depreciation, you add back in amortization, you add back, these are both non-cash expenses.
Yeah.
So they decrease your taxable income, but it's not because you wrote a check.
Yeah.
It's because you invested in a building a long time ago,
Yeah.
and you're spreading out the cost over 20 years. And taxes and interest and all of these expenses that lower from net income down to taxable income for tax purposes, but they're non-cash.
Yeah.
They're cash, or they're like taxes and interest, which are more like, they're not business income.
Right.
And so there's lots of measures you can use to figure out what was my bank account at the start of the year, and what was my bank account at the end of the year, and what was the increase.
Yep.
And that sometimes is more valuable as the value of the business rather than, what does my tax returns or financial statements say? I
agree with that. What do you think the biggest mistakes you see in divorcing with a business, or that you can, I guess, imagine?
Well, one big mistake is not putting in some protections early on, which we talked about, where everyone is hopefully thinking a little clearly, a little more fairly, and working out, look, if something happens, then this is the process we will go through to either confirm we're not going to exit, or if we decide to exit, this is how we're going to do it.
Right.
Because if you don't, you have a vacuum, and a vacuum, empty space is always filled.
Right.
And if you end up filling it at the end in an environment which the emotions are high, you have lawyers involved that their goal is to get every last penny possible for their client, and when you get into, as you mentioned, valuations, which is more art than science, and you have all these variables, it can be just really expensive, both in terms of fees and in terms of just emotional investment to try to clean it up or come up with a solution later, compared to doing it at the beginning, which literally it may be a half an hour some lawyer's time in a 1 hour meeting, and you have a structure set up that you just implement. Yeah.
There's 3 ways that I would say that you can probably protect your business in advance before you get to the divorce, which would be, first of all, a prenuptial agreement, which if you have a business that has already been started prior to marriage, I would 100% say that you should write a prenuptial agreement. This is something to protect the business, and again, to help clean it up, keep it clear, and really protect your interest and your growth that you make, that you've already invested in the business. The second thing is a post-nuptial agreement. Now, this is something that can be done after you're married, and really is, again, like you're building a business, and maybe you're bringing in partners, or there's different things that you're doing that you're really wanting to ensure that you protect the business from outside, influences. And one thing you want to remember is, if, say, you start a business with a couple friends, well, they're married too, and maybe their states allow for some kind of equitable divide of the business as well. Well, you didn't go into business with their wives. Yeah. And if you don't have something protecting yourself, like a post-nuptial agreement, or your organization docs, which are the last thing I was going to say, if you don't have something that talks about that, then you are just setting yourself up for, because if 50% of marriages fail, I know that's a horrible statistic, but if that's the truth, than going into business with your partner who has wife. I mean, the chances are one of them are going to get divorced, and you don't want to have to get caught up on that. You don't want to risk the validity of the business and the viability of the business and being able to keep it running. So these are things you want to do. Another thing I was going to say is it's already hard enough, I think, to go into business with a partner. I've done that. It was a learning experience for sure. It was really challenging for me, but one of the things that we definitely did in our documents is we made sure we wrote up what happens if there's a divorce, and we had both our spouse write post-nups for it. It wasn't anything to, even in the post-nup, it's explained that it would be dealt with in the marital estate, but it was literally to protect that asset. So that, because if we didn't do that, then it most likely was going to be a forced sell, and I was going to be out of whatever me and my business partner was doing, because I was going to be forced to sell because my business partner didn't want to be partners with my spouse. Well, that's saying something, because Ryan is liked by everybody and people would probably love to be business partners with him. But anyway, so those are things that you really have to be thinking about in I guess in reality of protecting your business. And if you're starting it during the marriage, those organization documents, and it, like you said, it's a half an hour of meeting with an expensive attorney to make sure you do it right.
Yeah, I mean, may not even be that expensive a lawyer, but it's also there's a lot of, in some respects, you're only limited by your creativity, right? I mean, there are some situations where both spouses really contributed meaningfully to the business. And the decision going in may be, look, if the marriage doesn't work out, that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to just have to exit. If we both contributed and we both want to share in the upside, I mean, you can convert one ownership interest into like a non-voting.
Yeah.
And so so in other words, I don't have to cash out. You don't have to put an obligation on the business to buy you out at a time where the business may not have the money to do it, or it may really affect the growth. And maybe your deal is like we're both meaningfully contributing to it, or we've meaningfully contributed to it. And therefore, we don't want to necessarily force somebody else out, but we don't want to muck up the operations day to day with two people that maybe are struggling to communicate effectively or work together. And therefore, the agreement is whoever has the smallest amount, they just, upon the effectiveness of the divorce decree, automatically converts to non-voting shares.
Right.
So they don't have a say. They don't have any managerial rights in the business, but they still get a share in all the economic upside.
Right.
And the business doesn't have to go get a big loan or do whatever to buy them out of the asset that they legitimately created.
Right.
So every business is different, as you mentioned. Therefore, valuations are different, but also there are a lot of options on the table to be able to pick and choose from to design a way to hopefully allow this business, which may be an important asset for both couples, to not, it doesn't do any good to them, or if they have children, the children, to send most of the value out and give it to the lawyers.
Yeah.
And so it's not like it's not like you only have one or two options, which is like one of you has to leave.
Right.
There are a lot of options that will allow for businesses to run and continue to run really effectively even after the breakup of a marriage.
Right. I love that. Thank you so much. And I keep in my mind just thinking of Jeffrey Bezos and his divorce, because I believe that that's what they did, is because she contributed just as much in the early of Amazon, and then when they got divorced, it was here's shares, non-voting shares, I believe, and she sold them and was able to cash out her billions and is now, doing philanthropy.
Or I think, or she's slowly doing it over time.
Yeah.
Because she has such a big stake, she probably couldn't sell it all at once.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't impact the day-to-day operations. She has control over when to exit what she's built. And yeah, I mean, the business itself it does not appear that Amazon has gone through some traumatic experience when the founders or the founder and spouse have broken up. And that's
And maybe it's easier said than done when you're talking about billions and versus us when you're running that $100,000 business that you're working in the grind to ensure that you can feed your family every day. So, anyways, Kurt, thank you so much. I think this was so educational for our listeners. And I'm just going to offer that last word of advice that when you have a business, unfortunately, it's if you and your spouse can come to the terms that one of you get it and it's not worth very much and you guys can just assign it, I think that that's very, very easy and you should be able to do that. But if we're talking about that, this has been the livelihood, this is where majority of the revenue stream for your family is coming through, it is very, very important, I would say, to at least meet with an attorney, talk about these options, and make sure you do it right. Because one of the things you also want to remember is even if you guys choose to run the business together, this brings in Bill and Melinda Gates. They've committed to run their foundation for the next 2 years to see how it goes. But then they have this like extra strategy of what happens if it does not work out. I think that those are all things that you need to be thinking about, you need to be working on, and working with a really good, competent attorney to help you through this is probably going to save you, thousands and a lot of time and heartache in the future. So,
yeah, I'll just end with reiterating that. I mean, I remember having a conversation with somebody going through a divorce years ago, and they were fighting about something, and he, I'm not a divorce lawyer, so he asked me for, a referral. He needed somebody who was better. And I asked him, I said, he had like 2 little girls. I said, can't you just sort of work this out? Because if you bring in this person I'm going to send you to, it's going to cost a lot of money. And his response was, well, I'd rather go to the lawyers than to her. And I remember thinking, okay, lawyers, I guess, probably like to hear that, right? But I thought that's just it made no sense to me. Why you'd have, it wasn't a big estate, a marital estate, but it was a decent one. And I remember thinking, why don't you want it to go to your kids, right? Why don't you want to just share it amongst yourselves rather than just give it to the lawyers? And he was just angry, and he's like, I'd rather have the lawyers get it. And I think that is sad that when people get into that situation, and with a little bit of honesty up front, like we have to just prepare for alternatives, right? And doing a little bit of work at the front end, it really does allow you to keep a lot of your hard-earned earnings and assets within the family and not always go out to the experts.
Right. And that's one of the things I always say, that if you're in the cloud of emotion and you are just stuck in this anger and emotional state, then you aren't going to be able to make rational decisions, which is why find an attorney, though, that is willing to help you make those rational decisions. If you go to an attorney and the thing that they're saying is, oh yeah, I can get this, your spouse can get nothing, we'll fight tooth and nail, you're going to the wrong attorney. And you are correct. You will give that attorney way more money than is needed. It's not going to benefit you, your family, your future. And that's not the kind of attorney or kind of work I do at Coyle Law. We aggressively represent you for fair and quick settlements. And that's the kind of attorney you want. But you also want that attorney that's smart in understanding what a business is and is willing to do their due diligence to ensure that they can protect it the best that they can. Right. So thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, no one dies from divorce. You're going to be okay. Today, tomorrow, just take that breath, first steps. You're going to get through this. Thanks for joining us. Till next week. Thanks, Kurt. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed, please subscribe, follow, and share. I'd love to hear your questions and feedback. You can contact me at community@jillcoyle.com. See you next time. I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney. Any advice given on the podcast is general and shall not be construed as legal advice.